Bonjour and hello. I'm James, and I'll be your host for this season of the Everyday Forum podcast, an original Stratfest at Home podcast showcasing a sampling of the thought-provoking discussions from the Stratford Festival's 2025 Meighen Forum, the festival within the festival, designed to enhance and contextualize the performances in the main Stratford Festival season. The following discussion was recorded in front of a live audience in Lazaretus Hall at the Tom Patterson Theatre in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. Enjoy! Bonjour and good morning, everyone. My name is James Hyatt. I'm the Associate Forum Coordinator, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this morning's panel called Letters and Epistolary Novels. Not the most pronounceable title, but I'm very proud of it. So today we're talking about letters and epistolary novels, which we'll define in a moment. But letters, they are huge in a lot of plays this season. Dangerous Liaisons, of course, being the chief example, but also in Sense and Sensibility and in As You Like It, where you're putting letters on trees and all sorts of things. It's a huge sort of plot device in a lot of plays and fiction and stories in general. But what's interesting about letters is, they offer a limited perspective. Some things go unrecorded. We don't exactly know the whole story all the time. I always begin these talks with a land acknowledgement. Those of you who've been to these before or other similar events, you may be familiar with this practice. It's about thanking the natural world, which gives us everything, the land, which literally holds us up, the trees and animals and water that feeds us and provides us shelter and so on. It's also an opportunity to thank and acknowledge the indigenous nations that have cared for this land for generations. Time immemorial is a phrase often used, which, if you think about it, literally means times we don't remember. We don't remember them necessarily because they're not recorded. We know the names of many indigenous nations that have peopled this territory and cared for this land, the Mississaugas and other Anishinaabe nations. We don't know the names of a lot of others. They haven't been recorded in history, and those nations have unfortunately died out. The nations of the Neutral Confederacy, I'll often talk about in these introductions, they don't exist anymore. And the Neutral Confederacy isn't what they would have called themselves. Even the name often used for them, the Attawandaronk, is a name someone else gave them, the Hurons, I believe. We don't know what they would have called themselves definitively. That has gone unrecorded. And certainly before them, there were other indigenous nations that cared for the land. So in acknowledging the land today, I'd like to acknowledge the unrecorded nations and thank them for their caretaking this land that means, in part, we can be here today. I'm very grateful that you're all here. I'm very much looking forward to this panel. So who are these people anyhow? Immediately to my right is Christopher Hampton, the playwright of Dangerous Liaisons. I'm going to read selections of his extremely storied biography, which you can read in full outside, but here we are. He became involved in theatre while studying French and German at Oxford University and wrote a play in his first year. The Royal Court's subsequent production was so successful that it transferred to the Comedy Theatre while he was still a student, making him the youngest writer ever to have a play performed in the West End, a record which still stands. His plays, musicals, and translations have garnered, again, an outstanding list of awards, including 4 Tony Awards and 3 Olivier Awards. His works for screen has included an Oscar, 2 BAFTAs. Read all about it outside. His works for stage include original plays adapted from novels, including Les Liaisons Dangereuses, adapted into Dangerous Liaisons, musicals, libretti, and screenplays, including for the film adaptation of Dangerous Liaisons. Welcome, Christopher. Next to Christopher is Deidre Lynch, a native of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia. Deidre is now the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of English Literature at Harvard. She has published widely on 18th century and 19th century literature, the history of the novel, and the history of reading. Her publications include the prize-winning The Economy of Character, Novels, Market Culture, and the Business of Inner Meaning, and Loving Literature, A Cultural History. She's a longtime editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and has also prepared editions of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and Persuasion, and Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Welcome, Deidre. Next to Deidre, Amal El-Mohtar writes fiction, poetry, and criticism. She won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards for her short story Seasons of Glass and Iron, and again for her novella This Is How You Lose the Time War, written with Max Gladstone, which also won the British Science Fiction Award and Aurora Awards, became a New York Times bestseller, and has been translated into over 10 languages, and which you can buy outside. Her reviews and articles have appeared in the New York Times and on NPR Books. Her solo debut, The River Has Roots, also available for purchase outside, is out now from Tor.com Publishing, and she lives in Ottawa. Welcome, Amal. And last but not least, our moderator for today, Jessica B. Hill. Jessica is an actress, a playwright, and educator. She's a recurring member of the Stratford Festival of Canada for 8 seasons, member of the acting company, I should say. She's currently starring here as Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility and La Marquise de Merteuil in Dangerous Liaisons, and plays Phoebe in As You Like It. Past credits include Viola in Twelfth Night, Helen in All's Well That Ends Well, and Lady Anne in Richard III. Her first play, The Dark Lady, had its world premiere production in 2023, and since then has been performed in 4 Canadian provinces, has had its American debut, and been nominated for 13 awards, of which it's won 6. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, everybody. I am so lucky to be up here with these 3 people. Okay, I guess we're just going to dive right in. I guess the first question would be, what do epistolary novels, or the meaning of epistolary, mean to you in your work? And maybe we just go straight down the line. So Amal, if you want to start.
Gosh, okay. So what does it mean in our work? So epistolary, meaning just something that is to do with letters, for me personally, has been a way of thinking about writing in novels and storytelling that really foregrounds the existence of text. Like a lot of the time when you read a book, you're taking for granted, if you're reading a novel, that you're going to sink into the story, you're going to just, you, the reader, and the text both sort of vanish, and you exist in this space together where a story is kind of happening to you. Once you introduce into that textuality, once you introduced into that the existence of a written document, it calls attention to the fact that you're reading a written document. And I think there's a kind of instability that sets in where you suddenly have to become aware again of yourself as a reader and of the existence of writing and of text in the story that you're being told and the story that you're experiencing. And as soon as that shift happens, there's a kind of magic in it that transforms both you as the reader and the book that you're reading into these shifty, strange, enchanted objects, where now, as soon as you have been addressed as a reader, whether or not you are the person in the book, if you open a book and it opens with, dear so-and-so, you might know that a different character in the book is being addressed. But it could also be done in such a way that you, the reader of the book, are overlapping with that character in some way. So I think it sort of shifts your own boundaries of self and awareness and understanding. And once you have activated that kind of weird magic circle, so much possibility emerges from it. You can get into all these different qualities of intimacy, all of these different qualities of time, all of these different qualities of character, in ways that you couldn't, I think, if you just remained at that level of text where you take for granted and take as default the fact that a book has been given to you and you're reading it. I think that's where I would start with that.
That was such a great answer, and it's hard to follow that. I'm going to be like a professor and tell you, what epistolary means to me is the reason why in graduate school I shifted from being a scholar of Dickens and George Eliot to being a scholar of Samuel Richardson and Choderlos de Laclos, who wrote the novel Les Liaisons Dangereuses, on which Sir Christopher Hampton based his play. Because epistolary novels do such amazing things with the telling of stories. They have options for telling stories that somehow the novel, when it became a form that was defined either by a third-person narrator, as in George Eliot or Henry James or most of the fiction that kind of is in the bookstore today, or a first-person retrospective narrator. What it lost was what it had when stories were mainly told in letters, which was the case in the history of fiction throughout Europe for most of the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the great mysteries of literary history that people like me like to try to argue over is, why did the novel give up this form of storytelling? What was it renouncing when it did? And I will just add to what Amal said about the kind of attractions of a novel told entirely in letters by saying that 17th and 18th century novels don't present themselves as the work of an author. For the most part, they say, I'm the figure we now associate with those novels, Samuel Richardson, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They say, I found these letters, I've edited them, I've compiled them. Here's a collection of letters that I would like you to kind of know about. And it means a few things for the novel. It means that the novel is very cagey in its opening 2 centuries about whether it belongs to the domain of fact or whether it belongs to the domain of fiction. The editor says, I found these letters. What are we, you decide whether you think they're authentic or not. That editor will tell the reader. The other thing that I think that this form does is it involves centrally something that Samuel Richardson, my hero. I have 3 students who have Samuel Richardson tattoos. I feel like this is a real accomplishment of my teaching career.
I have so many follow-up questions. The main one is, are they tattoos of text or
They're
are they
tattoos of the coffin of Clarissa Harlow.
What?
And the
God.
emblem on the coffin of Clarissa Harlow. And if you've seen Dangerous Liaisons, you might remember that Madame de Tourvel at a very crucial moment is reading Clarissa Harlow, or at least has taken the book out of the library. So Samuel Richardson said that what his technique allowed for was something he called writing to the moment, meaning the letters are accompanying the action. Characters are writing about what's happening as it's happening. In our conversation on Zoom last week, I called this 18th century live streaming, and it has some of that appeal. And then the other appeal of the form is that letters are always being read by people to whom they're not addressed. There are a lot, including us, right? We're Clarissa, Madame de Tourvel, they were not writing to us, and yet there we are, we're reading them. And a lot of the action of an epistolary novel involves sort of intercepting letters, forging letters. Velmont is very good at both of those things. I discovered this in my first year of graduate school. As an undergraduate, I am ashamed to say, I argued my way out of my 18th century requirement. There's huge ironies there. And when I discovered this form, I was a convert. I knew this was what I wanted to think about for the rest of my life. So that's a very long answer to your excellent question, Jessica.
Thank you.
Well, luckily for me, the first epistolary novel I ever came across was Les Liaisons Dangereuses,
Start at the top.
which I was assigned as a student, and I fell in love with it right away. It seemed to me a book of incredible wisdom and naughtiness, I decided some years before I actually made the adaptation. I decided I would like to try and turn that material into a play. It needed quite a lot of manipulation because, of course, in the novel, the Marquise de Merteuil and Vicomte de Valmont never meet each other. They just write letters to one another. And that's indeed the response I got from most of the theatres that I first approached, when they kept saying, well, these people don't meet. And I said, well, I think I can probably arrange that, if you allow me. Anyway, none of them did allow me. And after about 8 years of this, in the mid-'80s, 1984, I just thought I'll sit down and write it. And I had an open commission from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and was able to do that. I don't think they were best pleased when they received it, but it turned out quite well for everybody. And I think, more seriously, I think that the form is inherently dramatic, because, as we've heard, you, the audience, know more than the characters involved in the story, and that's that was a great technique of Shakespeare's. If you see Much Ado About Nothing, there are about 3 levels of what the characters know, what they don't know, but the audience knows everything. And this is one of the great pleasures of epistolary novels. And clearly, I was just reflecting on this last week when we were discussing it over Zoom. I hadn't quite realized that since then I've done 2 more, because I did a musical in 2000. I did a musical version of Dracula, which is an epistolary novel, put together from letters and diaries and newspaper reports, and it's technically quite, it's very adept, the novel. And just recently, I adapted a short story by Stefan Zweig called Letter from an Unknown Woman, which in my version, which we did first in Vienna and then at Hampstead Theatre last year, is called Visit from an Unknown Woman. Again, for obvious reasons, because I needed them to meet. So I think of all the of the various forms of fiction, in a way, epistolary fiction is closest to drama, and that's what I've kind of benefited or sort of battened on in the last 40 years or so.
That's great. We're going to get back to that specifically, of its relationship to truth. I think is very interesting. Maybe we could do a little crash course on the history of the epistolary novel, and maybe even go into why it seemed to take over in France. But would you lead us on that?
I'll try. I was thinking about how best to answer this question this morning, and it struck me that the easiest way to answer it is to say that the post office, the state post office, is a creation in England and France of the late 17th century, and people were thrilled by the opportunity to use writing, and I'm going to call writing a technology, to use letters, that technology, as a way to keep in touch with people across great distances. And of course, it's sad to remember that at a moment when in both Canada and the United States, the post office is on its last legs, it feels.
And in Britain.
And in Britain, too. There we go. But some of the kind of response to the post office is maybe the response that you could imagine people having expressed at the end of the 19th century when telegraphy came into existence, or at the start of the 20th century when telephones came into use. And there's a funny, I think really interesting film of Les Liaisons by Roger Vadim called Les Liaisons Dangereuses, 1960, made in 1959, where the characters are using not letter writing, but tape recording, a new technology of kind of the 1950s and kind of telephones and kind of Vadim tries more or less successfully to kind of comment on, to find a filmic, an up-to-date filmic equivalent to the fascination with letters that you will find in the texts of the 17th and 18th centuries. People wanted to keep in touch because it's also a moment of empire building, right? People are being sent to Canada, to the United States. You want to keep in touch with family members. You rely on the letter to do that. Literacy rates are rising. So kind of starting in the 17th century, starting with texts like Letters of a Portuguese Nun, or this is one of my favorite titles, a woman writer named Afra Ben, Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister, 16, love letters, sorry, I blew it, love letters between a nobleman and his sister. The kind of novels started taking the letter form that I have been described and Amal described earlier. Sometimes the novels grew out of letter writing manuals. Literacy rates are rising in this era, and kind of people who are newly literate want models. How do you write a letter in this situation? Now I fear, especially young people of my students' generation would say, ChatGPT, write me a letter. But kind of in the 17th and 18th century, you would get yourself a letter writing manual that would have certain scenarios. This is the kind of letter that you would write if you found yourself in this situation or in that situation. And kind of in two instances that we know, both in 17th century France and mid-18th century England, people who subsequently became famous as novelists, including my hero Samuel Richardson, began by writing these letter writing manuals and just kind of letting their imagination escape and kind of really getting into the scenarios. So that's, I think, some way of addressing that question. There's more to say, but that gives us a start.
I was just gonna say to that, just it's so weird to think of ChatGPT in this context now, because I remember in my childhood, as soon as like just Clippy as a sort of Microsoft Word assistant, like, it looks like you're writing a letter, and stuff, and just sort of inserting itself as a little manual there. But yeah.
Actually, Amal, could you speak a bit about Time War and how it was written?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is, and it dovetails so well with just the post office thing. So my dear friend Max Gladstone and I became friends through letter writing by hand. In that we, so Max is a novelist in his own right. He had written a series of books called The Craft Sequence, which I highly recommend if you want to read about lawyers being sorcerers, which is very cool. Anyway, so I had been. I was reviewing books for NPR. I had read a book of his for that and really loved it, but we hadn't met. And we ended up meeting through science fiction conventions, and we hit it off in person. And we just started writing each other, like in the wake of having met and having spent a bunch of time with each other. I wrote him a note just like saying, it was so great to meet you. I was living in Glasgow at the time. He was living in Boston. So I sent him basically a postcard saying, it was so great to meet you. I'd love to stay in touch. And we were both physical media aficionados. We both loved fountain pens. We both loved like good paper and stuff. And we just started a correspondence, and we just started writing each other on the order of like a couple of times a month. And we still, there was the whole internet out there. It's like it's not that we didn't know that we could communicate by text and email and stuff, but text and email and stuff were all entwined with work and with a kind of just public-facing authorness, whereas whatever we wrote to each other within the bounds of a piece of paper was private, and in a way that really felt like it had just been sheared away from communication with people generally. And so we would comment on this as we wrote to each other. And we'd comment on the fact that there was a very specific kind of intimacy in letters that we would sometimes figure out what we were thinking or feeling in the course of writing a letter, not having intended to put it there, but something about having the pen on the page and stuff just brings out a thread of confession, and in a way that wasn't necessarily the case with a text. And we'd also comment on how there was a sort of time travel inherent in letters, in that we would, anytime I sat down to write Max a letter, I had to sort of invent Max 2 weeks from now. I had to think, where will he be? What will he be doing? What will he have done by the time he receives this letter? So I was always sort of inventing his future self to correspond with. And whenever he would receive the letter, he'd be receiving a version of me that was preserved in amber, basically, from the moment that I set that pen down. And that many things might have happened in the interim, but that he wouldn't know until like the next exchange. So we would comment on that as well. And because we're science fiction fantasy writers, we were like, wouldn't it be cool, if you could write a letter that was differently constrained by space and time? And this led to like the plot of This Is How You Lose the Time War is that there is a war in time. I guess all wars occur in time. There's a time war, literally, between two different competing futures. And they are conducting this war. It gets called an edit war in the craft, where they send secret agents back through time to do various actions that will enable one future to kind of triumph over the other. They can't both exist. So the story follows two agents, Red and Blue, who start writing each other letters from opposite sides of this war. And over the course of that correspondence, fall in love, basically. But the idea was that they have infinite access to time and space. They are superhuman, they're post-human. They are these intelligences that just kind of can crop up anywhere. And so they write each other letters in ways that are weird. So, one letter is seeded over time in the rings of a tree that is growing, so that it can only be read once the tree is cut, and then you can read the letter spiraling out of the trunk of things. Another one is like on a piece of cod inside a seal and stuff. So because they have all of this material at their disposal, and they're trying to be clandestine about this correspondence, all of this happens. But all of this had its roots in Max and I thinking about, like, what about correspondence is different from other forms of communication. And that the thing about truth in fiction that I find so interesting is that so often in epistolary novels, you're deeply aware of the possibility of interception, of forgery, of falsity, basically, and of misdirection and all of that. But our experience of writing letters to each other was of there being a profounder or more inescapable truth that's almost compelled by the act of writing in a letter. We talk about letter space as this kind of almost like space that you enter into with a nakedness of self that can also be very dramatic. So there's the fact that there is this twinning of confession and dissimulation or falsity that all can happen in those boundaries is, as Christopher was saying, very just inherently dramatic.
Did you feel, because there's something just so fascinating about having written this with someone else, where you are actually just writing the letters to each other.
Yes.
It borders on acting in a way that I just find so
and
wonderful.
In fact, that's right. And the writing process of it was that we were, the irony is like these characters also never meet. They are always, conducting weird actions throughout different realities and times. But Max and I sat across from each other in a gazebo to write the bulk of it. And the way that we did it was one of us would be writing. So the book is not pure letters. It's like the letters, but also the situations in which letters are being received. So there's third person as well as the letters. And so the way that we wrote it was one of us would write the letter and the other would write the situation in which it was being received. And we would discuss the situation and the form of the letter so that it could be referred to, but we never discussed the letters themselves. Like the letters occurred as surprises both to the person writing them and to the person receiving them. I didn't know what I was going to say in a given letter before I started writing it, and there was just something about the process that was pushing it forward. So it was a kind of role play, absolutely, like and literally like text-based role-playing games are a thing that exist and that Max and I have both played in the past. But we each took, like I wrote all of blue and Max wrote all of red. And we just did it in this way. And initially, Max, we discovered through this process, writes almost exactly 4 times as fast as I do. So we would be sitting there and Max, he also had a keyboard that had a lot of travel in the keys. So I could hear exactly how much faster he was. But in the beginning, he would write a lot faster and still like have to stop and wait for me to to finish what I was doing. But as we went on, he slowed down and I sped up. And there was this kind of incredible choreography that started happening, like when, like in my very limited experiences of being on stage, is like there was an energy that we were matching with each other where we found ourselves finishing at exactly the same time. And we would blink out of our writing and look at each other and go, are you done? Did you oh, okay. And we would swap laptops and read what we'd done and then say, this is amazing. And then swap them back and keep going. It was genuinely the most beautiful and nourishing writing experience of my life to get to do this, especially because as a writer, you don't usually get instantaneous feedback on the thing that you've written, often for very good reasons. But in this case, it was, it was working out. So it absolutely felt that way. And there was also that in that writing to the moment element, we found ourselves just drawing elements of our surroundings into it. We had no internet in this gazebo in the roughly wilderness. And so we only had our own bodies of knowledge to really draw on. And so as a consequence, mine is a very English literature forward situation. And Max, who studied Chinese language and literature in college, has a lot of that. So there are interestingly also 2 empires kind of in the back of this that all come in. Yeah.
Fantastic. Bring us back to Les Liaisons Dangereuses. Christopher, could you speak to us a bit? Well, actually, I want to hear everything about this, but you had spoken about the Age of Enlightenment. Like, why France at that time took this way of writing?
It's very interesting that Samuel Richardson sort of invented it in these big novels, which had an enormous success on the continent, and then the form was really taken up in France, particularly with Rousseau in La Nouvelle Louise and with Laclos, but also with sort of lighter writers, and actually with, for some reason, one of the dominant modes of literature pre-revolutionary France was pornography, and there are quite a lot of, there are quite a lot of epistolary novels by people like Sard, and so it was clearly something that had struck a chord, and of course in Germany at the same time, Goethe wrote Werther, which is not strictly speaking an epistolary novel because it's one person, but it was probably the most influential novel of the whole century, where people, formed Werther clubs and suicide clubs because he unfortunately does commit suicide, so why did this particular form strike that kind of chord at that time? And thinking about it, I think it's associated with the formation of what we call the Enlightenment, with the Encyclopédie, which was being put together by Diderot, who also wrote an extremely good epistolary novel called Jacques le Fataliste. And was entranced by the form and worshipped Richardson, and I think he saw it. He kind of saw that by giving a whole range of voices to a literary form, and actually also cleverly in wrapping into that literary form the situation that the objects themselves, that's to say the letters, and what happens to the letters, whether they're sent or not, and how they're received, and who intercepts them, and so on, become part of the plot. So that gives you a whole extra layer of things to play with, and it chimes with or coincides with the fact that people were turning away from one way of seeing the world, a religious way of seeing the world, into a fragmented, individual way of looking at things, and I think that's part of its appeal, and part of the reason that it's lasted, because all those virtues that the form has are hard to match in a single omniscient narrative.
Yeah. Can you speak to us about adapting this novel to a play where we do have, in the epistolary form, the notion of truth is not quite present?
No,
right?
on the contrary, it's rarely present. Well, the first thing I had to do was, luckily I'd been thinking about it and being rejected for so many years, because I thought about it such a lot that the first thing I did was I made an enormous map of where everybody was in the novel, and then, as if they were sort of chess pieces, just moved them from so that at the time the scenes in the play were required to take place, the people involved would be in the right location. So instead of it's basically there are 2 or 3 places in the city and one place in the country, Madame de Rosemont's chateau in the country, and it was a question of shifting people from one place to another. So once that was done, I had a sort of plan of how to proceed, and then I was very struck in the novel by how mathematical it is. It's in 4 parts, and there's a symmetry between the number of letters in each part. And so I decided I wrote a play in 18 scenes in which, in groups of 3, but not necessarily in this order, there would be a scene where just one event happened. There would be a scene in which a past event was described, and there would be a scene where some sort of dramatic development would take place to move the thing forward. So it would be past, present, and future, and also technically, for some reason which seemed to be appropriate, these groups of 3 scenes get shorter and shorter, and so that the kind of energy of the piece rises, hopefully, and so and it was just an enormous pleasure to play around with this wonderful material and try and get it into a technically satisfying shape. And once all that was done, I think, as is one of the most common experiences in my life, the deadline had passed. I wrote the play in 7 weeks, but having spent 7 years thinking about it, I suppose, it's another superstition of mine that if you write something fast, the energy with which you're required to put into it somehow goes into the fabric of the piece and comes out the other end because the actors act upon it. I mean, it probably isn't. It's just an instinct, but I find that there's a benefit in writing fast, and in writing faster in the course of writing particular project. So you'll start off a bit slow and a bit tentative, and then gather momentum. And I used to, when I was younger, I used to, in the last half of or third of the piece, I would go and live in a very expensive hotel in Europe, which would also spur me to finish it as quickly as possible.
In the play, you have Merteuil say, never write letters.
Yeah, well, I cheated really because I wanted to end the piece differently from the novel. What happens in the novel is, and Laclos got into a lot of trouble from this novel, and there's a fascinating correspondence between him and a very respectable lady novelist called Madame Ricomboni, who assailed him for being immoral, where he defends himself. But he had to be sort of careful, a bit careful. And so what happens at the end of the novel is that Madame de Merteuil is found out, and then in many pieces of French literature of the period, characters are involved in mysterious lawsuits, which you never get the detail about. And so he says she lost her lawsuit, she lost all her money. Then she got smallpox and was disfigured. And disgraced by all these letters coming out, she had to go abroad. And then in a footnote at the very bottom, he says, as a matter of fact, even worse things happened to her, which I can't tell you about. And this seemed to be like a sort of wink to the reader to say, listen, I have to do all this stuff at the end. I have to make the wicked pay. But really, we know what the world is. So when I wrote the play, I decided, and I therefore inserted this one line where she says to Valmont, one of her rules is never write letters. So in the play, she doesn't write letters, and she gets away with everything. But of course, at the end of the piece, she's got away with everything, but it's ashes in her mouth. She's not going to be happy because she's destroyed. She's laid waste to everything around her. So that was the thinking when I wrote the play, and then when I came to write the film a couple of 3 or 4 years later, I decided to go back to the novel and at least punish her a bit. In fact, when we were making the film, the script had ended with Madame de Merteuil being guillotined, and we shot it. We filmed Glenn Close being guillotined. At no doubt huge expense. And then when Stephen Frears and I looked back at the assembly, looked back at the end of the film, when the guillotine scene came, we both burst out laughing. So clearly that didn't work. And it was a spontaneous thing. Stephen Frears is very unusual among film directors in that he not only likes the writer to be on the set, he has it in his contract that the writer must be on the set. And so he and I and Glenn Close were sort of discussing this problem. And I said, maybe I can end with there's a wonderful line at the end of the book which says, and from then on, her soul was written on her face. So I thought, well, maybe we could just have a caption saying that. And Glenn said, I can act that. And so at the end of a day of shooting, we went to some corner of the studio and filmed her taking off her makeup. Just taking off her makeup, and our marvelous French lighting director, director of photography, had a little board which he wore around his neck like an ice cream salesman, where he was able to adjust the lights while still looking at what was going on in front of him. And the idea was that it would be a slow fade. So she starts taking off the makeup and he starts fading down. And just at the vital moment, a little tear came out of one of her eyes and started to run down her face. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the light comes slightly up again. And so this was one take in the corner. And when we looked at it, we thought, well, it's so much better than anything else that had been written. So it was a perfect sort of marriage between an actor's instinct and a you know, with the things that are available to you in a film set. So it's interesting to me that there are these two sort of different versions with different endings, and indeed, the play is being revived at the National Theatre in London next spring, and I'm experimenting with having yet a third ending, which I can't tell you about.
Oh, it's so fascinating to embody the character where I actually know these different endings, and it sort of dovetails into your story, what you were saying of these two parallel futures in your book. The character lives in all of them, and the ending is present in all of them, in all of our minds in a way, if we know these stories, you know? I'd love to ask the three of you, what were your first impressions when you first read the Dangerous Liaisons, or Les Liaisons Dangereuses? We're going off script, guys.
I keep trying to remember, and I would have to do research in my own life to figure out whether I read the novel before seeing the film or not. And I truly can't remember. They're very entwined for me. But it's weird. They're very entwined for me, and yet they are also extremely separate. Like when I think of Merteuil in the book, I don't see Glenn Close, which is part of why I think that I might have read it before. But they produce different feelings. When I think of the book and reading it, overwhelmingly what I remember feeling is this richness and this richness of being let into secrets, of just and strangely, I don't know why I feel the need to specify this with this degree of granularity. It wasn't a voyeuristic pleasure. Like I didn't feel like I was being let into secrets kind of as they were happening in the moment. It was more like the text. Like I remember the experience of reading it and feeling the text like in my mouth, if that makes sense. Like, have you ever like read something and it just is delicious to read? So there was just and I think the other thing about it was I was shortly after reading it, a dear friend who is also an actor, who also portrayed Merteuil eventually, she and I were playing a letter game. And so there's all this like ferment where essentially, and I was like 17 or 18 when this was going on. So, but we had invented a scenario in which we would have different characters who were writing each other letters, and we also had like physical letters, and that we would write, and just like we lived in the same city, so we were just like handing them to each other as like little surprises every now and then. But that was, I think, the question was like my impressions, right? Like, so my impressions of it were very much of being let into these secrets, being let into this kind of glittering and dangerous world, and just like how powerfully attractive these terrible characters were, and just like that existence of attraction and terribleness that were not in contradiction with each other, but that were actually entwined, was so magnetic and so just like delicious to read. And I keep trying to think if there was anything else I was reading at the time that made me feel the same way. And I don't think so. I think it felt so transgressive as well to read. So those were my impressions that I'm recalling. But yeah,
Shockingly modern. I think. So I read it on the heels of having read in the previous semester Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, which I've already referenced, which isn't shockingly modern in the same way. Clarissa is also, I almost brought it as a prop to show you. It's the longest novel in print in the English language. It's 1,500 pages long. Whereas what Leclos does, and you know, I'm a Richardson stan. Don't get me wrong, but what Leclos does is he distills that, and it's like a bomb going off to kind of, I mean, it's like a fuse has been lit and a bomb goes off is how it feels, definitely by contrast with Clarissa. So yeah, blown away, to stick to my explosive metaphor, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, well, I went to a boarding school near Brighton in England. And in Brighton, which was slightly sort of Graham Greenish, seedy at the time, there was a flea pit called the Cosmopolitan Cinema, which really showed off-color pictures of one sort or another. And we used to have afternoons free to do whatever sport you chose to take up, and sometimes I would put myself down for a run and get on a bus to Brighton and visit whatever happened to be playing at the Continental. So at the age of 14, I happened to see the Vadim film referenced earlier, Les Liaisons Dangereuses, 1960, which had been banned in various countries, and which I was sort of, was taken mostly by the fantastic performances of Jeanne Moreau and Gérard Philippe, which is about as perfect a cast as you can imagine, and rather disappointed in the storytelling aspects of it. I think. Anyway, that was so the title was lodged in my mind, and so when I came to read it when I was a student, I guess I was 19 or something, I hadn't been prepared for how absolutely devastating a book it is. I still think it's one of the best novels I've ever read. And it has this sort of Shakespearean sophistication and breadth. And I think as reading it at that age, I also thought it was like the best sex education a young boy could have. So that's how I first came upon it, and unusually, there were a few texts I cherish from university, but this was the one I found myself reading year after year, and somehow, it lodged like a tick in my brain.
Can I ask, did we all read it as students?
I guess so. I certainly did, yeah.
Yeah, it's occurring to me that there's something really interesting. I didn't read it in a scholastic context. I was just reading it for my own interest, but it's interesting to me that we're all in a kind of ingenue position with regard to the book.
Yes.
Do you know that the book is such a seduction in so many ways?
Well, I was at Oxford, and one of the things was that you had to choose a period of literature if you were studying French. And there were 5 periods. The modern period, which went up to, I think, at least 1914, went from 1782 to 1914.
What?
And,
okay.
And that's the modern period. So we had an introductory semester where we read a representative text from each of those periods, starting with Rabelais and the Roman de la Rose and the modern text, which had been written in the very first year of the syllabus modern period, was Les Liaisons Dangereuses. So that's when I came across it. It was I can date it almost exactly.
Yeah, I remember reading it in school too. I was probably 16 or 17, and my reaction, are we allowed to do this? Like, it's really good. Like, it was just so, yeah. Huge segue. Deidre is also a Austen scholar, and Austen is connected to this topic as well. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Of course. So I said earlier that we don't quite know. One of the debates literary historians have, because we can't decide, is kind of why did this form, which, we've been talking up, and Amal has shown you how incredibly useful it could still be, why did this form disappear? And Austen is often seen as pivotal in that disappearance. We are pretty sure that the first drafts of both Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility were written as novels and letters. In other words, kind of without that witty Austen narrator that for those of us who are Janeites, and again, I'm a Janeite, we think that's one of the primary attractions of her fiction. But both those novels have pairs of sisters. In the case of Pride and Prejudice, Jane and Elizabeth are separated. One's in London, one is traveling to Derbyshire. Eventually, we think probably that took shape as letters exchanged between these pairs of sisters. So not sort of the love letters of the French tradition, but nonetheless letters that would kind of give you different perspectives on different things. A sort of standard way that I always teach Sense and Sensibility is to say, Eleanor is the post-epistolary novel heroine, and Marianne, who indiscreetly writes to Willoughby, it becomes an object of gossip all over London because of that indiscretion. She, with her French name even, is sort of the ancien regime of the novel, the epistolary heroine, and kind of the heroine who, is, I think, I wish I were seeing your production to know how you were handling this, but I think the heroine who is the moral center of the novel, who's Eleanor, writes bread and butter letters to her mother when they get to London, but doesn't write kind of the passionate confessional letters that get Marianne in such trouble. All that said, there is a novel that was not published by Austen during her lifetime, and wasn't published in the whole of the 19th century, called Lady Susan, which is entirely epistolary. And kind of people like me say, this is the sign that she read Laclos. And I would so recommend it. It's harder to find than copies of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. But Lady Susan is the Marquise, we could say. And rather than kind of exploiting someone else's daughter, the really shocking thing about Lady Susan is that she's exploiting her own daughter while still being a fully erotic being herself. But she's also sort of selling her daughter to the highest bidder. And it's a really well-crafted, beautifully witty novel that isn't the same Austen as the one who's so frequently adapted. So it's a huge segue, but there are definitely continuities. Yeah.
I also wanted to say that it has also been adapted into a Whit Stillman film, into a film by Whit Stillman called Love and Friendship, which I loved. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic. But I haven't read what exists of Lady Susan, so this is actually a situation where I'll have to go and separate those in my head. But yeah.
Right. Oh, it's amazing. In this adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, so much of Eleanor's fear is in Marianne writing, like, are you writing to him? Because if you're writing to him, it means that you're engaged. And just that, wrapping our heads around that is like, oh my God, it must have been, I think we're ready for questions. Oh, you pointed.
Oh,
They're on their way.
Oh, great.
Fantastic.
Well, say
Great.
actually one of the things that Max and I learned about historical letter writing, because we were as we were talking about this and as we were talking about doing this kind of project together, we were looking at a lot of the 19th century, in particular, history of letter writing, and we looked at a lot of Austen's letters and correspondence, just like Austen's own. And if you don't know this about correspondence, like to save paper, they would cross-write the letter so that you'd write the letter one way and then you would rotate the page and then write over what you'd written. So you end up with this incredibly cross-hatched document that seems impenetrable.
The one reason you do that is that the recipient of a letter paid the postage. So you had to write,
Yes.
your letter had to prove its worth,
Yes.
since the recipient had paid to receive it, had paid a fee
Yeah.
to the postman. So yeah.
Exactly.
John Keats, the poet, also crosses his letters.
I think, and am I remembering right that sometimes if you'd written a very hefty letter, you'd include a penny in it to help offset the cost of the person receiving it.
I don't know that.
I seem to remember that being a feature, and I'm trying to think of how that would have worked. but yeah.
There's a thing called letter locking, because you don't want to pay, since you're paying by weight as well as distance traveled for your letter. You don't want to pay for the extra weight of an envelope. So people like
You
Austen
learn the extra weight of a
learned-
penny.
You learn to fold it up in such a way that you could tell whether it had been intercepted and tampered with. So you can go online. There's an engineer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who has a long kind of video of letter locking techniques from the kind of early modern period, from like the 16th century through the 19th.
I love that. I mean, I'll keep vamping about letters as well while Jessica looks at these. But a dear friend of mine studied the letters of Bess of Hardwicke, who was a contemporary noblewoman of like Queen Elizabeth, who was basically Mary Queen of Scots' jailer for a period of time. And while my friend was studying these letters, like one of the things that she was studying were the different letter writing protocols for writing to a steward versus writing to a fellow aristocrat and so on. And the protocols weren't things that like Clippy could help you with necessarily, right? They weren't about forms of address specifically. They weren't things that you could just easily apprehend. They were phrasings and encodings of personality, like the degree to which you were sort of letting personality emerge, or your relationship with the person being addressed emerge, were things that were very, very difficult to forge. So where you could forge a person's handwriting a lot more easily than you could forge their spelling, especially when spelling was really idiosyncratic and not standardized. Knowing how someone spelled a given word was to know that that was more likely to come from them and stuff. There were all these ways of just encoding authenticity of a letter in the physical things. But yeah.
Did you talk about code, like writing?
Oh, right. Basically, just to make sure, if you wanted to make sure that the person receiving your letter knew it was from you, there were ways to do that weren't necessarily, ciphers and stuff, but literally could just be your spelling and your phrasing and things that a person would know about you and stuff. So yeah.
Oh, it's so fascinating. All right, here we go. Is the epistolary novel essentially a form of literary voyeurism?
Should I start? Yes, in some ways. I mean, as many other things besides, but Christopher already mentioned kind of its affiliation in France with a pornographic tradition. When I teach the form, I always mention an early title, which is of an early fiction. I think it's 1716. Charles Gildon, not known now, shouldn't be known, but this title is so great. It's The Postboy Robbed of His Mail, or The Packet Broke open. And the promise is just that, somebody has stopped the postman, and here are the letters for you to read. And there is, kind of something that we haven't said, right, is that kind of there is a history of privacy that is also part of the history of this form. And the form is always interested in revealing the private to a larger public. So one way of thinking about the ending of La Close novel, Les Liaisons Dangereuses, is to say that it tells the story of the making of the novel itself, insofar as all of these letters start. Velmont leaves Danceny the letters, and Danceny starts circulating them, and they get a wider and wider readership. So the private is made public, as it's also in some ways published. So the form is always thinking about the publication of the private. So in that way, I think, yes, it is voyeuristic.
I'm gonna beg you to correct me on this if I'm wrong, because I'm remembering something from undergrad at this point. But is it correct that the 18th century also saw a sort of architectural development of the hallway as a technology? Like, this is the many things that we take for granted is that hallways exist, right? But if you can imagine, if you've ever been to like a medieval manor, right, there aren't so much hallways as there are rooms that open into other rooms, and there just isn't the same understanding or conception of privacy that we have when you have doors that shut onto hallways. And what I'm remembering is that this was part of my being taught Pamela, because Pamela
also by Samuel
Richardson, which okay, I can't talk about Pamela. Okay, just put a pin in Pamela. But a feature of Pamela, which is largely about a virtuous young woman resisting the dastardly advances of her terrible employer. Until she marries him, spoilers, sorry. But anyway, until she reforms him with her unflappable purity. It's a wild book to read. But a huge part of it, she's writing letters to her parents detailing the things that have happened or failed to happen to her. But a huge part of them is that she keeps getting cornered in hallways by her lascivious employer. And that in of itself feels like part of these letters. There are these dark corners that are threatening and that are dangerous, that letters are kind of illuminating by sending them home and stuff. But there's this very real sense in that the domestic space from which letters are being written starts to have this quality of privacy that is threatening because it is hidden, something that whatever happens to you in this space, basically, that doesn't happen because in a situation where other people are around to witness it. And so letter writing is kind of involved in that as a bearing witness in some ways. So I just think of those as kind of entwined, and just that I always have that thought, that fact is stuck in my head because it was so weird to realize that hallways were not always, basically.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Hot take on that. In Quebec, in Montreal, I'm sure that people have seen the plateau with those beautiful staircases. Mm-hmm. Apparently, they were created so that you didn't have hallways leading to the other rooms because there was hanky-panky.
Oh!
It all comes back to Dangerous Liaisons.
Yeah, exactly.
Handwritten versus typewriters versus word processing. How did evolving technology change the process of function of letter writing?
Oh, well, I still write by hand, so I still write my manuscripts by hand, and it's just a habit. It's just something to do with the rhythm of writing by hand that's satisfying without all that frightful clacking. Yes, I do use a computer to correct things, and I put the manuscript onto the computer, and then but in a sense, the virtue of the different the different formats is that if you write something by hand, I then give it to somebody else to type out, and it comes back, and it seems like a different. It seems much more objective. It seems like a different. It seems like a comment or a different piece of work than what you originally did, and that's quite helpful in revising, I find.
The extra distance between you and the manuscript, absolutely. I feel a very somatic and embodied difference between what I write by hand and what I write on the computer. I learned to type very early. I never so I was born in 1984, and so like I was taught typing on a computer. There was no like typewriter in between. And I learned to type when I was about 7, I think, and learned to type very quickly as well. So my handwriting was absolutely surpassed by typing. And what I found was that I could write at the speed that I was thinking, which is not the case when writing by hand. So there's something that inherently, when I write by hand, slows me down and forces me to inhabit my thoughts this is a very strange thing to say, but in a very different way. And there are some kinds of writing that I really want that for, and other kinds of writing where the flow state that I'm seeking is one that comes more from having the keyboard disappears for me. Like I don't look at the keyboard while I'm typing, and so there's just a sense in which whatever is happening in my head is appearing on the screen. In a way that when I go back to engage with can also have that lack of familiarity that really enables revision. I outline by hand a great deal now. And also if I am writing, I often write poetry by hand. It's just a fundamentally different experience. But all of these things are being kind of engaged with by the fact that they're all hyper communication technologies now. So because in the same way that like Max and I found this different experience of writing and writing by hand, Max also has written full novels by hand. And there's a real pleasure in seeing the physicality of like a bottle of ink be diminished by the number of pages that you've written with it, or a journal being filled up. Like all of these markers of progress that you just don't get with a word count or a page count on a document. It's all invisible. And I find when I read Max's books that there is a not a better or worse thing, but just a qualitative difference to his prose when he's written a novel by hand than when he hasn't. And he has said too that one of the things that he finds is that when he then has to bring that text to the screen to transmit it and stuff, he finds that he repeats himself a lot more by hand because you're not always going back to reread the stuff that you've written. So I think that there are absolutely all differences. They're very embodied differences in terms of the writing that gets produced. And I think that but it's not a matter of valence so much as it is a matter of just qualitative differences. But yeah.
I'll just say very quickly that one of the amazing things about the 17th and 18th century enthusiasm for letter writing is that writing was actually very difficult in the age before there were steel nib pens, for instance, which don't arrive until the 19th century. You have to take a quill, right, a quill usually from a goose, and shape it with a knife. And Austen has her young, slightly hapless heroine, Fanny Price, wanting to write a letter to her brother William, but needing her cousin Edmund's help to sharpen the pen. It was a difficult act involving much more manual dexterity than now in the age of Bics, never mind in the age of laptops.
Yeah.
I think that's important as a kind of context to bring to the reading of these epistolary fictions.
And drying the ink for that
Yeah,
matter, like
with the
blotting.
pounce, with what is called pounce.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's pounce. There's a professor who I used to know was saying that doing archival research sometimes meant like being handed a document and lifting it and sand poured off it because it hadn't been read since it had been blotted with a kind of sandy powder and stuff. And it's extraordinary. Like all of the physical traces of these things that are just like vanished now that we have digital technologies. I always think about that in terms of their longevity, for that matter. But because there's a curious thing that happens with archives where archives will, digitize physical documents, but they will also print out emails. So there's this like kind of like you need both kind of thing going on. But anyway, yeah.
Oh my gosh. There's something like, do you feel like it impacts writing on the keyboard? You're more likely to edit as you go. It sort
absolutely.
of stops your flow.
100%. I did say that. Until for me personally, the way my brain works, so broadly, my experience of discussion with fellow writers, there are writers like Max who write a first draft very quickly, and they sort of write to figure out what they're writing, and then a lot of it emerges in the revision, and so they'll go back and they'll revise it and they'll fix things and they'll write more and they'll edit. For me, what ends up on the page is very, very close to the final draft because I'm both editing in my head as I'm going. Like before something ends up on the page, it needs to feel right in my head. And then if I leave it for any amount of time, which could be 10 minutes, and come back to it, I need to get back into it, reread what I've written. And as I'm rereading it, I'm usually editing it more. And so I'm a very slow writer. But usually the thing that I end up with at the end is about as close to the final draft as it's possible. Well, I say this, I'm aware that my husband is in the audience who has witnessed my writing of the last few things, and it's like, no, a new revision process has to emerge the longer things become. But with short stories in particular, that was very much the process of just always editing as I'm going in a way that until I hit a flow state in my head where I'm no longer thinking of that, which usually is a strange and numinous experience that is difficult to just produce on command, then there is a lot of that stopping and starting and going back and just getting it right.
Right. Because you talked about set in amber, the time capsule of it, and that part of that is also the mistakes, or it makes me think of Greg Doran that's going on this huge trip to see every first folio that he can.
Oh, wow.
And it's partly for that, right? It's all of the little things that show, this editor, maybe, he had ink on his fingers and he smudged, or he wrote in the margins, or it's part of what makes it so tactile and immediate, right? I've heard historians concerned about the lack of prime sources of letters and diaries for future research because of email, etc. Do you have a concern for literature?
Gosh. I feel like I've been talking a lot. I will turn around, but
I don't think I have more of a concern for literature than for everything else.
correct. Yeah. In the grand scheme of things.
Everything seems to be subject to, but it might just be getting old. But everything seems subject to a kind of deterioration that one wasn't quite expecting, and there are so many paradoxes involved. In other words, as we all know, the internet and so on, which was invented to save people time, has of course stolen everybody's time, completely consumed everybody's time, and so on. So things do not turn out the way you expect they're going to, and so you can't really predict what's going to happen. But it's not looking good.
My concern for literature is not about whether there will be archives for people to explore. My concern for literature is whether it will still get read. Right, the latest statistic, right? It's kind of the number of people who read for pleasure has kind of crashed again in the United States. I mean, I've never understand those polls because, in fact, the internet demands that we do a lot of reading, but kind of the number of people who read novels or attend plays or read poems, never mind the number of people who write poems and write novels, that's I'm worried about that, not about archives and emails and archivists. I know lots of archivists. They're really smart. They're figuring this out. But yeah, who will be around to appreciate those archives?
I think there's something really interesting happening in terms of consuming literature from the market side of things, because I exist in a commercial publishing sphere. The market share of audiobooks has really, really skyrocketed in the last, I want to say 5 to 8 years. Maybe you should say 10, because the pandemic always the pandemic was a huge part of this, apparently. But what I've been seeing have been studies looking at our attention spans diminishing. And it's interesting to me that same thing, which is a problem, I feel has to be entwined with the audiobook market share going up, because people, I think, broadly listen to audiobooks while they are doing other tasks. Or certainly that's my experience with podcasts. Like I listen to audiobooks while I'm driving. I listen to podcasts while I am, doing the dishes or folding laundry and stuff. And I think those are all things that you can't do while you are physically reading a book. And it's also interesting to me from like a student perspective when I think about students and the world they're entering in terms of reading, and how many demands on their attention and how many seductions away from just reading a book there are when you exist in an ecosystem that wants you to just like get marks for your next thing so that you can, get a job. I don't know. It's all bad. It's all inimical to actually engaging with a text in a way that is a relationship between you and the text. But I think that if audiobooks, if performances actually, I feel, are something that cannot be digested yet by large language models, by AI and stuff, so that if you're a student, trying to save time by asking a terrible software object for a summary that is riddled with errors and also will not convey to you anything of the experience of actually reading a book. If you listen to an audiobook instead, you are being delivered a performance of the book that I would hope is still, whole in a way that hasn't been interfered with in the same way. So I don't know. I'm heartened by this. I'm heartened by the fact that text can't just be like digested in this way. And I keep thinking of how often we talk about consumption with text and reading it, and what you're getting with the current information economy is just this regurgitated awfulness constantly. But anyway, sorry, I'm veering on tangents, but
Do you think that found footage films are the film equivalent of epistolary novels?
Oh, absolutely. Can I
that's
do
really
this
cool.
one?
Yes.
Yes. So, I love this. I love this question. Whoever asked this question, thank you. I do think so, and I think I'm old, so some of you are too. Maybe you remember this film called The Blair Witch Project.
I remember that.
that presented itself, as a found footage. Was it real? Wasn't it real? There was a whole sort of internet buzz. Was this real found footage, or was this kind of a commercial film? It's gothic. People go in the woods. Bad things happen. This is absolutely the way kind of 18th century fiction worked. It had, I referred earlier to how with epistolary fiction, the work is situated at the boundary between the fictional and the factual. This fiction made you think about what's the difference between a novel and a hoax. The perfect example of that is another novel of Diderot's called La Religieuse, which is a nun writing letters. She's been confined to the convent against her will. She writes to Diderot's friend, the Marquise de Merteuil, and it was Diderot all the time. But he fell for it. Yes, he offered her employment in his household. He shed many tears over it.
Oh my God.
It was like hoax designed for one person, as opposed to the kind of hoax that, say, Edgar Allan Poe would perpetrate later in 19th century America. But it was a kind of hoax. So, and the letter form kind of lent itself to that, as I think kind of found footage experiments do now. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you consider novels that use diary entries rather than letters, such as Bridget Jones' Diary, a form of epistolary novel? It seems to resemble letter to the reader.
I would say so. I think there's a really interesting difference affectively between a book that uses excerpts of any text, like any textuality, and something that is more about the letters themselves. And I think that with a diary, I mean, a diary is still a correspondence, right? Like you are writing, whether you're writing to your diary in a Dear Diary kind of way, or whether you are writing your own thoughts. There's a sense in which the diary is a mirror. So there's always that element. What is different from, I think I would think of a diary entry and a letter as having different emphases, where a diary really turns the dial up on the confession aspect, and a letter turns the dial up on a self-fashioning kind of aspect of it, where it's just you're communicating with someone with a letter on whom you are trying to have an effect, or to whom you are trying to convey a self, and so on. With a diary, that is less there. It can be there. I think that one of the pleasures of Bridget Jones' Diary is that she's also like not entirely honest with herself a lot of the time, and I think that that kind of instability can absolutely still be there. But so I think that they're absolutely related to each other, and I don't know if there's anything to be gained in saying no, they're not the same. But yeah,
Heroines. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think the drawback of the form is a tendency to self-pity and sentimentality, and I guess that's what the objectivity of an omniscient narrator will take away. I think there are inferior, in the case of inferior examples of epistolary novels. I think there are a lot of moaning that such as exists in everybody's private diaries.
Yes, I will just say when things go really wrong for epistolary heroines, it's when they lose their audiences and they don't have any way to send out their letters.
Yeah.
So they're what would have been a letter turns into a journal.
diary. Yeah, exactly.
I think this is probably the last question. We'll see. I think it's for Christopher. Talk about atonement from screenplay into play and translations.
Atonement, yes. Well, that was a novel which I fell in love with when I first read it, and sort of applied for the job of writing the film, which I luckily got, and I think worked out very very much to everybody's satisfaction. And just recently, Ian McEwan has asked me to write a stage play based on a tome, which I did earlier in the year, and or last year, anyway, sometime. We're having a first reading of it next month in London, and it was very interesting how different. This is the experience with Liaison as well. How different the stage version is from the film, because I found it because the film is slightly better at portraying inner thoughts and introspection than I found it was useful to take the character of Bryony, the novelist who is narrating. And who was played in her when she's 77, as she was played in the film by Vanessa Redgrave, and turn her into a kind of narrator who's there all the time. So you get the same feeling you have in the novel of somebody reflecting back on the meaning of things that happened a long time ago and the effects those had on those around you. And but it's been a fascinating experience, and I'm looking forward to going forward with it.
Lovely. Thank you three so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with the lively conversations and original performances on the Stratford Festival streaming service, Stratfest at Home. And for making it this far in the episode, enjoy 1 month for free. Visit stratfestathome.ca and enter code FREEMONTH. It takes you, our listeners, to make this possible. It also takes the support of our dear collaborators. Support for the Meighen Forum is generously provided by Kelly and Michael Meighen and the T.R. Meighen Family Foundation. Original score for the Everyday Forum podcast was provided by Hilary Adams. Production support is provided by the film production and distribution team at the Stratford Festival. That is coordinator Vilma Mancini and director Jenna McGaw. The Meighen Forum team is producing assistant Renata Hansen, associate coordinator James Hyatt, manager Gregory McLaughlin, and director Julie Miles. Special thanks to Mike Duncan, Greg Doherty, and Harper Charlton. Finally, thanks to artistic director Anthony Cimolino and executive director Anita Gaffney. From here in Stratford, Ontario, on the land of the Neutrals and the Anishinaabe, see you next time. Ba Ma Pi.